In this video, we'll be covering a famous game between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov, and it'll help you improve your game by recognizing patterns and seeing some of the powerful things you can do by controlling files, sacrificing pieces, and moving your knights in unexpected and amazing ways. Please stay to the end of the video because at the end I cover 3 strategies for your knights that you can use after watching this video. So let's get to it. Anatoly Karpov begins with pawn to e4. And by this move, Karpov is saying, I win, because for 10 years he had won over and over again. But at the game he is facing Kasparov, a challenger that is up and coming. Kasparov responds with pawn to e6. And just think, we're seeing the game here where we pit the young upstart against the established grandmaster of chess that had been for 10 years. White moves his knight to f3, and black moves his pawn to e6. White moves his pawn to d4, and this turns the game into the open Sicilian. So the game of chess is largely about opening moves. The opening moves form the tapestry that all the rest of the game is built on. Each move has a set determination of moves that are weeded out and a determination of moves that are allowed because of the opening moves. That's one of the reasons for the opening moves, and people want to have a pattern of opening moves. It sets up an entire line for the future, what can be played and what can't be. And another thing, each player wants to set up chess for their own battle. They want to create their own battlefield their way so they can play by their tactics, their rules, if you please. There's an ancient proverb, he who chooses the battlefield wins the war. And that's by Sun Tzu, if you've ever studied Sun Tzu. And so what is chess if it's not a battlefield? A battlefield of the mind, a battlefield of wits. So black's pawn takes the pawn at d4. White immediately takes back with knight to d4, and black moves the knight up to b5. The purpose of Karpov moving the knight to this square has to do with the execution of the concept known as the Maroczy Bind. Karpov was famous for creating this, in his games. It was actually created about 100 years before by Maroczy. But this move, this intention was to tie up a square on the board so completely that it becomes a thorn in the side of the opponent. They can't get to the square. They can't do anything past it. It's a problem to cause trouble for the opponent. And Karpov is planning to set that up and cause trouble for Kasparov. If Kasparov had done nothing, Karpov's knight would have moved to d3, which would have made it necessary, the only move that made sense, to take the knight with the bishop and end up trading a bishop for a knight, which would have weakened Kasparov's side, especially the plan that he already had in his mind that he was going to do. So black responded with pawn to d6. I was behind a little bit. So we had the knight that I talked about going to b3 and the pawn to d6. So this added the protection of the black queen to the d3 square so that white could no longer take the pawn. So we have the queen is protecting this. So if he hadn't gone here, then this knight could have gone here, and then it would have been a problem. It would have forked the king, and the queen. It would have had to go here, and the queen would have there, and that's what it would have traded. So he didn't want to do that. It would have weakened his position. So the pawn goes to d6, and now we have the bishop and the queen on here, and then we have the knight and the queen here. So when you have an equal number of pieces on a square, it favors the defender, not the attacker. That's going to come up throughout this game over and over again, that particular issue, because we're going to see a lot of places where one side wants to attack but they can't because the other one's got just the equal or greater number of attackers or defenders, and that's something to keep in mind for your own chess play. Try to get an equal number of attackers means that you'll come out ahead in an exchange, generally speaking. If you're not if you're trading high dollar pieces for low dollar pieces or whatever. All right, so white puts his pawn up. That also attacks the d5 square. So we're creating this bind here at this square. We have this pawn, this queen, and we'll get some more stuff on there, but that's what we have right now. So this is the bind that we're talking about, created in the 1900s, early 1900s, and it was by Giza Maroczy, I think is the name, and I think I'm pronouncing it Maroczy. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it exactly right. You can look it up. I did look it up, and he played a lot of games using that particular bind, and he invented it. And he was one of the first grandmasters of chess. So black moves the knight to f6, and this is a very normal move. We're seeing a lot of normal moves, just both sides getting set up to play the game of chess. And for me, I see this as developing knights before bishops. I like to do that. The structure, though, with the knights and the pawns here, this is known as the hedgehog structure, and you can look that up as well. And it's where the two center pawns and the knights flanking the pawns, and you can also have a knight here instead. It is still called the hedgehog structure, but nevertheless, the next thing, white moves his knight to c3, another very normal move. But notice that puts yet another attacker on this square. I mean, that square is hopeless for black to do anything. I mean, that's the intent of white, to completely create an area where, and these four squares are the central squares. The more control you have of those squares, and the more you can see those squares and attack those squares or defend whatever, the more likely you're going to have a better position in the game of chess. So then black moves his pawn to a6, and that kicks the knight away, and it sets in motion a bizarre set of moves for white's knights. Now, this knight has already gone through a lot to get here, and now it's going to be kicked, and it's going to have to move more. And as you watch this knight move around, both knights really, this game is called the Drunken Knights, an example of the Drunken Knights. I've watched a few games, and not a lot, but I haven't seen this particular kind of movement of the knights ever. Karpov moves his knight to a3. And Garry Kasparov was prepared for these moves. Like many chess players, Kasparov had studied the games of his opponents. In this case, he'd studied the games of Karpov. He knew exactly what to expect out of Karpov, and he suspected what he would play, and he was prepared for those moves. Now, interestingly, he was seen on an airplane, a long airplane ride, and he had a small chess travel set, practicing and studying his opponent and his moves. And his work paid off. Kasparov was bound and determined to win. And he was also bound and determined to be the first one in 100 years to defeat and break the Maroczy Bind. And so Kasparov snubbed the whole idea, moved right onto that square. Forget the Maroczy Bind. I'm going to move on to that square. Now, we still wind up with a bound square later, but still, this is what he planned to do. And the thing is that Kasparov had tried this move against Karpov in game 12, and Karpov didn't expect it, and he quickly played the game down to a quick draw because he wasn't prepared for the line of moves that would come after that particular move. It wasn't in his planning. This time, Karpov was not surprised by the move, and really it looked like Kasparov was giving up a pawn for nothing. Here we go. So then white's pawn takes at d5, black's pawn takes back, and then white's pawn takes again. And now we're kind of stuck because this is attacking the knight, but that, believe me, is part of Kasparov's plan. He could have taken here, he would have taken, it would have been an exchange of knights, really, not really. Not really, because once again, we have two pieces on this pawn and two pieces on this pawn. So the attacker is at a disadvantage. The defender is at an advantage when you have something like that going on. So he would have had to take away one of the attackers or add something to the pawn or something, who knows. But he would have had to do something along that line. So Kasparov moves his knight to b4. And he's getting ready to set up his knight for something very powerful on enemy territory. He's already crossed over the line to white's side of the board, but he's going to make it even worse than that. So in some ways, white is wasting time here. Karpov thought that he was safe because of the powerful Maroczy bind. However, having the white knight at a3 is a hidden weakness. The pawn cannot come up and attack this knight. This knight is kind of safe here. Normally, this pawn would come up and kick the knight away. Well, he can't do that because this knight is stuck here. And this knight really doesn't have a decent place to go right now that would be strategic. So he just kind of has to sit there for a while. Normally, this would be kicked out of the way, but he doesn't get kicked out of the way, and this makes all the difference because Kasparov continues to set it up to place this knight in a strategic manner. So I missed that white, here we go. So white played the bishop to b2, and this is essentially saying, I don't care, if you take that pawn, take it, because after the exchange, Karpov would be in a better position. So he's just kind of moving here. He could have moved his bishop here and protected the pawn even more. He didn't do that. And it was just like, who cares, make this happen. Of course, he did get his bishop here, which is, expanding the reach of his bishop and getting his bishop more into play. But instead, Karpov moved the dark squared black bishop to c5. Now, when talking about this match, Kasparov said that he went through the deepest study of his life in preparation for it. Now, he had more than 20 moves prepared for other position that he moved, with all kinds of alternative moves and things that Karpov could have answered or done. He had all those moves well thought out. And so the bishop, before he moved the bishop to c5. Now, in his excitement, he revealed later he made the wrong move. That wasn't the move he planned to make. He got the order wrong in his mind. Moving the bishop to c5 was not part of his plan, but interestingly, this move confused Karpov, and all white really had to do, if white had moved his bishop here, we could have taken out the threat of that bishop right now. Wouldn't have been a big deal. He could have done that. He would have gained a tempo probably, or something would have happened, but he chose not to do that. But it would have neutralized black's bishop and taken away the advantage. Kasparov's unplanned move made Karpov make a small mistake as well. He castled. Now, normally castling is not bad, but in this case, you can see the line move just a little bit back toward white. So not much. Actually, it must be. Yeah. Okay. So the engine doesn't really say it's a mistake, but according to the analysts that I've read and listened to, it was a mistake because it allowed Kasparov to get back into his game. And so Kasparov also castled, got it out of the way. Then Karpov moves the white squared bishop to f3. It's like he's saying, okay, fine, if you're not going to take the pawn, then I'm going to make it impossible for you to take it. I've got the light squared bishop on the pawn now, so now we do have three things on this pawn, making it impossible to take. But black moves his bishop to f5, and this is setting up for the positioning of this knight right here, because when the knight goes there, it's going to be well protected, and the queen won't be able to take it. It's one of the most important moves of the game. When this knight gets to that position, it's going to be mucking up the whole works for white. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about it more later, but it's called the Octopus Knight in that particular position, because Kasparov was about to encroach on Karpov's side of the board, his position, his planning with this knight, completely ignoring the pawn at d5. Instead, he built a protected garrison within white's side of the board to make that knight possible, to make it safe, and to keep it there beyond what you would expect. So to answer this, Karpov places the dark squared bishop on g. Notice that when he went here, that knight is pinned to the queen. Kasparov can't move the knight. If he moves the knight up there, then the queen is gone. So that obviously that's not what you want to do. And so notice the board goes greatly for white if that knight is put up there. So we lose the queen, etc. So it denies black the ability to protect the e4 square, this force here. And if white moved his bishop to that square, black took the bishop, the knight would, of course, take back without black's knight being able to be involved. So it would be a problem. If Karpov succeeded in taking the white squared bishop from black, then he would render the knight on b4 much less effective. You don't want this to disappear because Kasparov has great plans for that square. So instead of doing something, kicking the bishop or whatever, Kasparov takes control of the f file with his rook. That is an amazing play. You always want to take control of a file when you can, and he does that. So not only did he control the file, but he's getting ready to make it where that Karpov couldn't put his bishop on e4 anymore because of the extra. Oh, that's right. So look at this. So now we have an extra player on this square. So we have more stuff going on here. We have Kasparov has the bishop, the knight, and the rook on this square. And if Karpov moved his bishop there, he only has the knight and the bishop there. So it's a distinct advantage any way you want to look at it for Kasparov. White moves his queen to d2. Now this fully developing the pieces. You want to get the queen off the back. So now the rooks can see each other. That's fantastic. And the queen is up more into the game. And the queen is also offering protection for this square as well. And that's a good move, a good normal move. Kasparov moves his pawn to b5. Now, what this does, it highlights that the knight at a3 is weak. You recall the saying, a knight on the rim is dim? I think that's what it is. It kind of rhymes, kind of funny. Because this knight only has control of these 4 squares. Well, that's not very many. I mean, a knight that was, sitting on this square, if a knight was sitting here, he'd have all 8 squares under his, where he could go if he they're legal moves that the knight can make. So this only has half. So a knight on the rim is dim. You really don't want to put a knight right there. It just only has half the squares it can control. And this move by Kasparov helped further identify the limit of White's knight that's on the rim. White did a powerful thing here. White moved his rook from a1 to d1. So when he moved his rook here, he created what's called a battery. It's the queen and the rook are on the same file, and it's a very powerful move. It's got a lot of power in it. It's difficult to defend against. You have to work at it, or maybe just avoid it. Black, at this point, makes his move knight to d3, and this is the positioning of the knight that becomes later called the Octopus Knight, that White can't take right now. There's no way the queen can take this knight because the bishop will take the queen. You're not going to trade, a 9-point queen for a 3-point knight. Just not going to do that unless it's strategic. You might do it strategically. But why was the pawn at b5 so important? This pawn is going to go here and fork these 2 knights. So by moving here, not only did it create a frustration for Karpov, but it also, we've got a move coming up. And so any chess player, you're doing this, right? You're looking for what your opponent can do next, checks, captures, and threats. So, but, Grandmaster's on a completely new level or better level than I'm ever going to be on. Well, no, that's not true. I would love to get to that high level. I'm working on it. I'm sure you are as well. It's just, it's difficult. But he looked at this, and he could see what was going to happen. And so his next move was to get that knight out of the way. Now, this knight was being moved away from the risk, but think how many times that knight has moved. That knight started, here? And I think it went here. And then it went to d4, be here. And then after d4, it went to b5. Is that right? b5. No, is it going to be b5? Right there. So not here. b5. And then a3, and finally here. So look at the journey that knight took. I've never taken a knight. I don't think I've ever taken a knight on such a journey. And I haven't seen anybody else do that in games. And so the knights that he moved around, both the knights moved around a bit. And this knight, party, whatever you want to call it, became known as the Drunken Knights. And it's a fascinating thing that happened here that, Kasparov forced on Karpov. So now Kasparov begins to put on the pressure, and he moves the pawn up to h6, threatening this bishop, kicking it out of the way. And so White has to decide what to do, and White moves back a square, which keeps the pin on the queen. Keeps this pin on the queen. There's no way that he's going to move that knight unless it's extremely strategic and got a really good reason to do so. He's just not going to do that. So sometimes when you've got some stuff going on this side of the board, which you do, sometimes you go on the other side and do something, kind of take the pressure off the side that you're working on. So to do that, Kasparov moves his pawn to b4, threatening this knight. So now that knight's going to have to move. Where's it going to go? It's just not got a lot of places it can go. Can't go there. Can't take your own piece. Can't go there, you lose it. Can't go there. Can't go here. Can't go here. Can't really go there. So it's really a problem for the white knight. So he just drops back to there. Notice the knight is now actually kind of strategically threatening this piece. That piece is protected by this knight, but there's no way that Kasparov wants to move that knight down and lose it or whatever, or get rid of his fascinating strategic positioning that he has. Notice that we have another knight on the rim, which is dim, and we also have a knight here on the rim, which is also dim. So we have a serious. Karpov has trouble with his knights right now. They're both in bad situations. However, the knight does serve to attack the bishop at c5, which is only protected by the knight at d3. So Black moves this bishop here, getting it out of danger. A nice simple move. And also behind this pawn. This pawn in some ways acts like a barrier or a shield to anything passing through there. That's kind of important, and you may look at it as that way later on as well. Karpov moves his bishop to g3. He's threatening this bishop here. And he's no longer pinning that knight, and that frees that knight to go and do something. So now this knight is free to go do stuff wherever he would like to go. Take the pawn or whatever he'd like to do. He can do that. He can make something happen. Karpov moves his bishop to g3, threatening Black's black squared bishop. One of the things that we're at here right now is that Karpov is one pawn ahead. Now, one pawn ahead in the grand scheme of things doesn't seem like much because you have all your pieces. But as you trade pieces down, you get to the point where that 1 point actually makes a difference. It's kind of like, in any other situation, just a little bit of advantage makes a small difference when you've got your entire army. But when you get your army down to the last few men, that small advantage suddenly becomes a big advantage. So Karpov would probably like to trade as many pieces as he can. So he's setting up the trade for this bishop. But Black answers with something that is fascinating. He now controls the F file and the E file. That is amazing. More than that, White can't move to challenge these files because of the knight right here who is threatening those squares. So that is a powerful thing of this Octopus Knight, what he is controlling so many things. Karpov needs to do something to get out of this. He has to be feeling frustrated and threatening, so he moves his pawn up to b3. Now what this does is it gives an area of retreat for this knight, and he'd like to move this knight up here and threaten this knight here and protect his rook or something. But so he moved up to do that. And Kasparov doesn't want to see the knight go to b2 because it would be attacking that critical knight and changing things where he doesn't want to see him change. And it could cost him the game. So right now black has a slight advantage according to the bar here. The engine says he does. That's kind of cool. So what in the world is Kasparov going to do? He moves his pawn up. Moves his pawn up to g5. So one of the problems for white in this move is it is a threat to play g4. Because if he moves here to play g4, this bishop doesn't have a decent place to go. He can't go here. He can go there. And but either way, we have a rook now that's on that same path as well. So that's not a real good strategic thing for white to consider. And the engine still says that black's ahead here. Karpov decides to take the bishop. And Kasparov takes back, which is fine. White moves his pawn up. And why would he move his pawn to g3? He moved this pawn from here to here. He moved his pawn to g3 to allow a place for this bishop to go and be protected and also still be able to attack this pawn. Kasparov moves his knight to d7. So we don't have to worry about the bind anymore between the queen and the knight isn't pinned, and his knight can go and get involved in the game. There's just a lot of fascinating things going on. White moves the bishop back as anticipated to g2 to get the bishop protected and getting it out of a future threat if black moved his knight to e5. Because if this bishop had stayed here, then if Kasparov had moved his knight here, it would have threatened the bishop. Karpov was able to move his queen to f6. Why do you think he did that? Always look for what your opponent can do. This queen is now looking right at the square. It makes it impossible now for Karpov to retreat his knight to that square, because suddenly we would have this knight and the queen on that same square, which wouldn't be good. Now, we talked about this knight called the Octopus Knight, and we kind of showed it a little bit, but this knight here is looking at this square, and this square, and this one, and this one, this one, and this one, and this one, and that one. So that is all 8 squares that a knight can look at. Look at all the power that piece has. You know, a rook can control maybe 16, a queen even more. A bishop can control, a lot of places. But I just don't think of knights controlling 8 squares. That's amazing. So he's controlling 8 squares, and it's controlled the Octopus Knight, and that's why, because he has all that power, sprawling his limbs out where he can take control of things and cause trouble for the opponent. I mean, that's kind of what I think of it. What kind of trouble can I cause for my opponent? Well, that's a lot of trouble that Kasparov has caused for his opponent. Karpov moves his pawn up to a3 to threaten this pawn. Undeterred, Kasparov moves his pawn up to a5. That way, if he takes, he can take, and we still have this pawn here, which restricts that knight from going to those squares. He can't go there. So, white takes the pawn, black takes the pawn. This knight is watching over this pawn. It's protected. And it keeps this knight from being able to go somewhere. This knight can't go anywhere. These knights are just, they're made ineffective by how Kasparov has the board set up. At this point, and notice where white is. Look at all the pieces. He's got his bishop here. He's got his pawns here, watching over that the king and his rook's the best place that they can be for right now. This battery set up waiting for something. Really can't do anything with his knights that makes any sense. If he goes here, it's a bust. If he goes there, it doesn't work well. It's just a frustrating thing for him. And notice that the advantage is moving ever more toward black and less for white with the engine, the white bar for the engine. I just can imagine, what he's going to do, because he really doesn't need to do anything. He just needs to sit there and wait for his opponent to make a mistake of some kind. So he can't do anything really. So he moves his queen to a2. So, and where can the queen go? The queen can't go there. It's attacked by here. He can't go here. He can't go there because it's attacked by the rook. He could go back where he was. So, but he can't go there. It's attacked by the rook. Can't go there or there. So really the queen it didn't have many options for the queen to go from this point. Too many squares were in jeopardy by Kasparov's pieces. So black was probably really smiling. Kasparov was really smiling on the inside when he just said, I'll play my bishop to g6 and I'm fine. And it did improve it a little bit. It, add a little protection to this pawn and to this here. But we're still watching over this knight. Very powerful, very amazing. Karpov didn't have a way to make moves that improved his position at all. He really didn't want to move. And of course, you can't pass in chess. You can't look at your position and say, I pass. You don't get to do that. Then white moves his pawn to d6. He needed something to do. He moved his pawn. He's like saying, fine, take my pawn. I just don't care anymore. Put that pawn out of its misery. And maybe Kasparov will capture the pawn, doesn't have to think about it. And of course, that will put him back on equal footing. But instead, black moves his pawn to g4. This is another move that accomplishes very little, but it makes it where the bishop can't come here and the bishop can't go there. So it does do a little bit. And that was a strategic move on Kasparov's part, because this pawn now can't go here without having to deal with this pawn. Kasparov is continually improving his position bit by bit by bit. White doesn't have the option to improve his position. He's too bound up in Kasparov's plans. So next, white moves his queen back where it was. Not much else he could do with it at this time. The queen does attack that pawn from here. So that was a strategic move on Karpov's part. But undeterred, Kasparov just moves his king up. He moves his king up to protect this pawn. I don't know about you, but I get nervous when I have my king and queen on the same diagonal. I mean, I've lost my queen before, and I've also looked for my opponent to do that. Why do you think that you might feel safe in this game by having your queen and king on the dark squares? Because those bishops are off the board. The only thing that would happen would be if this queen went here, but that wouldn't do much. I mean, I guess we could exchange queens or whatever, but it's not like you're going to get the queen for nothing by going for this diagonal here. So, that you don't have to worry about it as much as I would, kind of be worrying about that. So the next move that white makes is he moves his pawn to f3. Now, there's a lot of masters and grandmasters and great videos to watch on YouTube, and I watch a lot of them. They're fantastic. One of them is Ben Feingold. Ben Feingold, grandmaster, says, don't move your pawn to f3. Why? Well, it leaves this entire area open for you to go and put the king in check. And, Kasparov's going to take advantage of that. And because he's trying to open up the file by taking the pawn, he's trying to open up this file here, because if he takes here, then he attacks his queen. The queen's got to do something. So it does give him a file to control, and then he would be watching over this pawn. So, maybe he's thinking he could get this queen down here somehow and attack. I don't know what he's thinking, but he took a risk by moving that to f3. And so black, this is a great opportunity. Black finally takes that pawn and puts it out of its misery. That pawn is out of the game. Served its master well, but it is finally completely gone. And now the king can be checked by going here. So if this pawn takes, the queen can put him in check and take this pawn. That's kind of cool what he can do. And I mean, that would be something in my simple way of thinking I would be thinking. But that's not the way that the thought's going on here with these two grand masters doing battle. White takes the pawn at g4. And black takes advantage of the check and puts white in check, and white has to move out of the check. And so white moves the king to h1. And then black gets another knight into the game by moving his knight to f6. The next move will likely be to e4. If he moves his knight here to e4, it threatens his queen. That's one thing he could do. White gets his rook to threaten the queen. Now, this is really the beginning of the last few moves of the game. We're winding it down. There's a lot of intensity, a lot of things going on. Karpov puts his rook there to threaten the queen and cause trouble, and all we'd have to do is move his other rook here, and then he could take this knight. So there's all kinds of things that could go on. This is kind of a strong move, but still, the advantage is all for black. 3 out of 5, whatever. So it's really, really a great advantage for black still like that. And so you would think that he would move out of the way or do something, but instead he makes a fantastic move. He does indeed put his knight at e4 that blocks the rook and threatens the queen at the same time. Isn't that amazing? So now we've kind of got our own bind going on. Maybe we should have another bind called, the Kasparov bind or whatever. But it was really a problem for white going on. And so Kasparov moves his knight to e4, protecting the queen, attacking the white queen. However, notice what it does. The Octopus Knight is now in dire danger because we now have 2 attackers and 1 defender for that knight, and now the advantage is on the attackers. So all white has to do is take the knight. White takes the knight. So that Octopus Knight that had served so well for so many moves and been so powerful is off the board. He was a mighty defender, a mighty attacker, something good for the game. And so now it's a good soldier, and he's gone. But he served his master well. Karpov does something. I don't know if Karpov saw that Kasparov could do that. Because look what he did. He moved his knight from e4 to f2. And look what this does. This forks the king, the queen, and the rook. I call this, or somebody called it, or gave me the name a long time ago, a family fork. It forks the entire family. I mean, it could have forked more than that, but that's kind of cool to fork that many pieces. White has to decide what to do. So white takes the knight with his rook, but that leaves this queen completely open to be taken. And Kasparov indeed takes the queen. And that is an incredible thing that Kasparov was able to engineer with his incredible moves. Now, we have another battery set up here. It looks bad. What's he going to do now? Well, Kasparov moves his queen here. Moves it closer to the king. Protects this bishop or not, whatever he wants to do. But then, but look at the evaluation. The evaluation is almost nothing for white, almost everything for black, because it has moved that direction the entire time. So when you think of the genius of Kasparov in this game, and you look at the game and you consider it, maybe you can see why that he's been at the top of chess statistics for the last 20 years. He there's records that no one's beaten. He's been a grandmaster. He's still a great guy. I mean, you look at him, he's happy and intelligent, and he's involved in the chess community. And he's won the most games. He's been the highest rated player in history. And this is kind of an example of that. The rook takes the bishop, and Kasparov must have really enjoyed making the next move. Look at this move. So he moved his rook from c8 to c1. Now look what would happen. If Karpov takes the queen, then Kasparov takes the rook, puts the king in check. The king would have to go here, and he could take the queen, and it would be the end of the game really for Karpov. Kasparov is in that good a position. So it's kind of clear that no matter what happens next, Karpov's going to lose a lot of pieces. Then you can go through a lot of you can look at more scenarios than I said as well. But at the very least, it's an incredible attack that was unleashed, and so it looks like the queen can be taken, but he can't. Karpov can't take his queen because of what else is going on. It's just not going to work for him. It's just not going to be a thing that he's going to be able to do. So finally, Karpov is able to move his knight to b2, protecting these two rooks, And now the queen can't take the rook. And of course, this can take the rook, which isn't a bad idea. I mean, there's a lot of things that can go on. But he puts his knight there. And so now Kasparov needs to decide what to do. He puts his queen to f2. And then it's almost curtains, because all that he would have to do is put his other rook here, or take this rook and then put the rook there, and it's take this. It'd be the end of the game. It's checkmate, really, really close to checkmate. Matter of fact, I can't find any white on the bar for the engine bar saying what's going on. So then Kasparov takes the rook. Karpov takes the rook with his knight. Kasparov puts the king in check with his rook. That has been waiting to do that on the e file all this time. He puts his knight in the way, and then he takes with the rook, and then the bishop takes, and that's checkmate. Now, actually, I think I forgot where they resigned. I went ahead and finished the game for him. When he moves his rook to e1, okay, this is the place where Karpov resigned the game. Fine, you win. And so I just played out a scenario of how it would be if they continued the game. If they continued the game, he could have put his knight here, and then it would have taken with the rook, and then the bishop would have taken the rook, and then the queen would have taken it. It would have been checkmate. So that's how I finished. The game doesn't finish that way. And now for the bonus content. 3 interesting things about knights. Really, it's going to be more than 3. More like 4 or more, but whatever. But you can count it however. So we have this on the screen. It's a fairly normal setup. I did move the queen up from here to here, so you can get a look at how I did that, because I'm going to show you. So every knight, you want to have your knight at least 3 squares away from the edge, because your knight controls 8 squares ideally. If your knight is at least 3 away from the edge. If it's closer than that, you begin losing squares, and you can lose more than half depending on where the knight is, if it's stuck in the corner, for example. But have you ever thought about putting both knights together? What it can do? So I have this here. I'm going to move this knight here, and then I'm going to have some kind of move here for black, and then I'm going to move this here. Now then, I have the knights together. Look at all the squares that the knights control. So we have this one, and this one, this one, this one, and all around. So that's that. And then this knight controls these squares, and this one. I mean, it's just an amazing number of squares that are controlled by 2 knights together. So when you put 2 knights together, you've got a very formidable thing. Now then, if you had it a different way, say you had the queen here, and we'll put this up here, just whatever, and you put this knight here, and then black would move something. Then you'd have this. This is a more common way. I've seen this. I've actually done this. Of course, in this case, this knight, you see it, is 1 away. So it only controls, this square and this square and this one. It doesn't control quite as many squares. Of course, this one does, which is great. But it just gives you quite a thing when you have both knights together. So that's one thing. Try putting both knights together in your next game and let me know how it works out. So then I have a situation where this is actually one of the traps for the Caro-Kann, but it's at the very end of the trap. So I won't go to the trap right now. But notice this knight. If this knight goes right here, this is a smothered checkmate. So be on the lookout for how you can check your opponent or fork your opponent with the knight. I love the knights, and I still tend to favor knights above rooks. Of course above rooks, but above bishops. A lot of people favor bishops above knights. I really tend to like that. It's one of my weaknesses. And then here we have a situation where you're white and you're getting ready to be put in check, and you've got a problem. So that the queen moves here and puts you in check. What are you going to do? Now, you could move the bishop here, and the bishop's protected by the knight. It's not a bad move, but then the queen can go here and put you in check, or here and put you in check. The queen has more options. So instead, if you have your knight, if you put your knight here, then the queen, if the queen goes here, it can't go there because you just take the queen. And And so how do I get my queen back? Wow, not sure. So maybe I can put it this way. There we go, got my queen back. So if the queen goes here, then of course it's the same sort of thing. So if you can defend yourself with your knight, if you have a choice, do that. And so those are the three things I wanted to show you. Thanks.